My talk is called Abstraction, Pareidolia, and the Underloved. I am um, going to try to advance here. Oh, it won't let me do that. Okay. So one of the works that has had such a profound sort of impact on me, and one of the artists in particular, David Hammonds, who's had such a profound sort of impact on my practice, is an Black American artist. And this particular work I've shown for one other talk, and it seemed very relevant to share this work with you today. This is from David Hammonds's Rock series, and I found this work so compelling because it is this sort of geological element that is combined with human hair. And the human hair is hair that Hammonds collected from Harlem barber shops in New York, from various Black patrons of the barber shop. And you can see this sort of diagonal line here across the sort of shape of the dome that sort of indicated different styles, hairstyles of the time. But what most fascinated me about this particular intervention, and he has a series of several of these rock heads, is that it combines this sort of geological time with the social dimension. And I think that was very profound. There's also this sort of element of pareidolia that exists within this image. Pareidolia is this sort of phenomenon in our brain's capacity to see faces in many things where there might not be an actual face, but our brain, has this tendency to suggest that there is a face. And you experience this a lot in terms of there's a lot of sort of religious encounters with pareidolia, for instance, where people see the face of Jesus in their breakfast cereal or, something to this nature, where something very mundane begins to take on this sort of personified experience. And so this is a work that I think about quite often, and we'll come back to this sort of notion of pareidolia. One of the earlier works in my practice is inspired by this woman who is Henrietta Lacks. And Henrietta Lacks was a tobacco farmer who lived in the sort of Virginia, DC area. And I was interested in her because she had cervical cancer and she went into one of the hospitals at Johns Hopkins and they extracted some of her cellular material. She unfortunately passed away from the cancer, but her cellular material became part of the first immortal cell line. And this immortal cell line was used to found some of the first biotech companies. Her material was also the first material to be sent to outer space. And this was very striking because Henrietta herself was restricted spatially in the kind of care that she could receive in the locations of hospitals that she could actually receive care at because of segregation in the United States, which restricted, where Black people and people of color could access certain things and what civic spaces they had access to, as well as what private spaces they had access to. Um, so I'm thinking about all of these sort of these boundaries and the how these sort of boundaries can become porous as well. Like, despite that, like some of the scientists that did research on her cells, white scientists in particular, whose name I'm forgetting, injected some of her cellular material into his own children. So there's these things where um, these moments in which the body and this sort of like racial capital attached to these certain moments of extraction also become very valuable, also become these thresholds and these portals, which can indicate um, a certain other type of value that can emerge, but also highlight what is not valued and what is not cared for. So this series, Portrait of a Woman 1, Portrait of a Woman 2, um, actually shows this Google image of Henrietta Lacks, as well as this image of Henrietta Lacks's cells that are growing on a diamond. I worked with a scientist and a scientific imaging specialist who was able to image her cells using a scanning electron microscope. And I wanted to sort of collapse these different types of values upon each other and think about the value of forever and this sort of marketed performance of a diamond being forever in combination with this cellular material. Um, so this is actually the scanning electron microscopic image, and I will show you this point here is where Henrietta Lacks' cells were populating. I'm moving now to a film that sort of shifted my trajectory in thinking about material histories. This is the Slave Number One theater that was located in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. This is the Reverend Al Sharpton, who was an activist um, and sort of politician. This site was really important for being a sort of Pan-African and civil rights gathering place for many people during the 80s. And it was founded by this man who was a judge in Brooklyn, Judge John Phillips. And according to this New York Times article from 2008, he had this sort of small fortune of $10 million worth of buildings and these two theaters that he purchased. And he called it the Slave Theater so that no one would ever forget our struggles. The other theater was the Black Lady Theater. And this story sort of went in a different direction because when I encountered the theater, this is the actual state of what it looked like. Um, it almost looked like there was some sort of catastrophic event or disaster, and everything was just sort of abandoned in place. Um, the theater was being squatted at the time, and a friend of mine wanted to show me these murals that were on the wall before I left, before I moved out of Brooklyn. And we trespassed into the theater, and my foot hit something, and it ended up being this image, this object here in this image on the left. And for those of you that are familiar with analog film, this is a 35 millimeter reel of film. Of course, it shouldn't have any of these sort of angular forms and shapes. Um, so this was a badly deteriorated 35 millimeter reel of film. I didn't know what was on it at all. I sent it to, at the time I had moved to the Netherlands for the Rijksacademie, and I was sending this film to different labs to be processed and transferred. And they would send it back saying they couldn't transfer this film because it had vinegar syndrome. And I sat on it for a long time. And it wasn't until my parents' home caught on fire, which is where I was storing the film, that, this sort of push came to do something, to take an action and to do something with this material. And so I had this residency at Yaddo in upstate New York. And my colleague next door, I told him I didn't have anything to properly do this transfer, but I had brought a 35 millimeter slide scanner, but not for 35 millimeter film, cinema film, but for 35 millimeter photo film, which has different dimensions. And so we went to one of the DIY shops, and she suggested using this sort of plumbing material to create my own. And I ended up creating this reel here with this sort of plumbing flanges and this plastic core. So you can see this setup here. This is like in lieu of a rewind. This is what I had, this sort of Flintstone archaic setup that was all manual and, just drilled into this table that was in the studio. And these were some of the first scans. And you can see that the scan itself was not even the correct dimension. So it's got one frame here below this line and then a third of another frame above it. But it was this very curious um, act and this sort of meditation on a film that I'd never seen. And it took about 2.5 to 3 months to scan like 20,000 frames, which was about half of the actual film. And the sound, there was no sound on the film. So I began researching more about this theater and more about Bed-Stuy at the time and looking into different archives. And I ended up completing the film with my own sort of narrative. Um, and that's Guerrilla Means War. This is the first iteration of it showing as a film in a gentrified space, which was really important because the theater itself was demolished to make way for gentrification. And I will move forward. So this is, I got the opportunity to do a residency at Visual Studies Workshop, and the director at the time invited me to make an artist book that included some of all of this sort of voiceover from the film, but we sort of reinvented the context by using images from Visual Studies Workshops archives. So it took on this other life um, in the artist book. And I'm just showing you this map from the early 1900s from the Oil and Gas Journal. Um, and I wanted to point out specifically Oklahoma, which is where I'm from and where I'm joining you from today. So you can see this area here. This is roughly where Tulsa is in the sort of northeastern part of Oklahoma. And this is a more recent map from 2013 showing this sort of byways of some of the refineries and crude oil production. And this is Black Wall Street. This is Tulsa, Oklahoma in the early 1900s. This is an area called Greenwood, and this is a space where there was a large number of um, freed Black people who settled and who had established a number of businesses and livelihoods in this sort of self-contained enclave within Tulsa. And in 1921, it was bombed, and over 30 blocks of this community were destroyed. And many people fled, many people are still unaccounted for. And there hasn't been a proper sort of act of reparation. There's still one survivor who remains, who is a centenarian. Um, and this is what it looks like today, but it's kind of this a shell of what it used to be. So after the bombing, there was a rebuild, but during the sort of model cities era and urban renewal periods, like many other cities in the United States, the federal government subsidized these highways to be built, and a lot of them were strategically built through Black and Brown communities across the United States to purposely use eminent domain and use these other tactics to displace people. When I first went to Tulsa to live in 2016, I did some workshops with the senior community, and one of the elderly male seniors um, saw his name in this book I brought and realized that his aunt had been a victim of this massacre, um, but had survived, right? And had never heard that his aunt had been part of this particular massacre, um, or was even affiliated with this history. So while he was aware of the history, didn't realize this family member had anything to do with it until he saw her name in this book. And I think that really sort of encapsulated this nearly century long silence that sort of marred this history. And upon the anniversary, the centennial in 2021, I was invited to do a show in downtown Tulsa at a space called AHA. And I finally found this archive of images that I wanted to sort of revive. So many traces, physical traces and material traces had been destroyed and not tended for. So I wanted to sort of think about um, multiple things, including this connection with land. So after the area was firebombed in 1921, there was a restriction in terms of um, who could rebuild, and they had to rebuild with bricks. So that limited already a lot of people being able to rebuild, especially after only one insurance claim was honored, but none of the Black homeowners' insurance claims were honored. Um, and so this series, Notes from Black Wall Street, incorporates the ceramic shards that I made and actually included in these sort of collaged paintings of people rebuilding during that era. And these are just a few examples. I'm also interested in sort of um, the way that I can think about the thickness of paint, this sort of impasto-like thickness, um, and think about that in relationship to a scar, and think about that in relationship to, um, the way the body is sort of healing on its own, that there's this process within our compositions where the body can heal in all these different ways. And sometimes the mark of that remains. And there's also this element of abstraction that I am always sort of bringing to my interventions in the archive, and especially in this engagement with the figure. And I want to get at this sort of interference, like this sort of visual interference, these different ideas of camouflage and protection and hypervisibility. This is just a close up so you can get a sense of how this sort of drawing and painting and photo elements, and the ceramic bits look in a very close sort of optical measurement. This one is called Luminescent in a Homemade Field. In the interest of time, this is a film that I made around some of that history as well. And I'll just play a little bit for you.
My name is Hughes Van Ellis. Am I am 100 years old, and I am a survivor of the great mass. Because of the mass, my family was driven out of our home. We were left with nothing. We were made refugees in our country. I did my duty in World War II. I served in combat in the Early East with the 234 AAA gun attack.
So that film was created from an archival film from Solomon Sir Jones's collection, who was a Black businessman, entrepreneur, and also traveling pastor that went around the world actually in the early 1920s and 1930s, and did a bunch of sort of filming of all these different communities. In the US, he was focused on looking at various Black communities and self determination, and those that had been able to establish townships, thriving townships. And um, I was really interested in using that footage. So the footage that I used was from various parts of Oklahoma, including Tulsa, around that time, because Oklahoma had one of the highest numbers of Black townships after the Civil War. So this is the installation view of flight at Oklahoma Contemporary. And this is three other sort of archival pieces that are part of that installation that I manipulated, and just a view from the other side. A publication that I edited with some additional writers. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. And I'm going to share this tiny clip with you. This is from a film that I shot in Sweden in a spa town. And this spa town was, Varberg is undergoing massive shifts, as many spaces are in terms of migration. And I wanted to sort of rethink the histories of place and belonging and monuments in this particular area. So it's a very sonic and performative film. Um, and I am sort of working through this other series at this moment, which incorporates these manila envelopes and this sort of raw abaca. Um, and this raw abaca, my mother's from the Philippines, and so I've been looking at this history of how the United States took over the abaca industry. The Philippines is responsible for, I think, 80% of raw abaca production in the world, and the US took over this industry and during colonization. And I've been thinking through this material history as I work through this paper making material and thinking about the various iterations. So while they're no longer made of abaca, the manila envelopes were formerly made from the manila ropes, which I have in another image here. So this is the manila rope that was usually thicker and bulkier for use in marine circumstances and naval circumstances. And once that rope wore down, there was this inventor and paper maker who decided that this material might be good for paper making. So they upcycled it into these manila envelopes. So you get these sort of iterations of a raw material, a raw extracted material from this colonial period, and these other sort of iterations and life shape shifting of that material throughout these particular works. Um, and I'm interested in sort of thinking about this form as sort of cartography that I can create through this sort of abstract compositions in these particular pieces. So you see the same thing here. This is raw abaca over a cotton pulped panel. Okay, so just a few words about it. Is that Nicodemus, it was never fully incorporated, but it was this town that was established after the Civil War with a lot of freed Black people, former slaves, and or formerly enslaved. And I think that it was really fascinating to me because it's on this very sort of isolated bit of land in Kansas. And people were excited about the prospect of sort of building this community, but it was very difficult land to even farm. So a lot of those hopes dwindled almost immediately. Um, and that sort of marriage of a bit of the history of Nicodemus um, was compounded by this sort of residency research trip I did in Switzerland many years ago. Um, I think over 10 years ago now, with under this curator and a slew of different scholars. And one of the things that we did over that trip was to visit the Rorschach archives of Hermann Rorschach, the Swiss psychiatrist. And it became really interesting to sort of think about these artworks essentially that were created to assess one's intelligence, to assess one's sort of mental well-being, and that this sort of protocol became incorporated into a formal aspect of psychology and intelligence testing. Um, and yeah, we can talk more about this later, but I just wanted to raise that. And this was an installation version with the film at Artist Space. So it was compounded again here where it's like mirrored on the floor. So in the film, you see that it's sort of this Rorschach-like image, but here it becomes even a double Rorschach in a way. Um, and it is surrounded by this OSB board that's used for construction, which is sort of like a skin on a building, um, the first sort of physical layer. And that was created in this sort of parquet-like design on the floor. So viewers were intended to walk around the perimeter of this particular space, um, and be sort of entrenched in this audio. So I'll stop there and stop sharing, and we can move into the conversation.